Week 2 of Design Thinking for Leaders. Thank you so much for coming back. And I think it's going to be a great discussion because we got a couple of design thinkers on the line with me here. So you guys are going to be keeping me true to the philosophy, as well as adding some good insights from your experience. So I want to thank you both for being here. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I do want to start with a recap of last week. We had some feedback in the survey, which Candace is going to drop the survey link if you did not have a chance to complete it. Would love your feedback on it. Obviously, this is kind of a beta for leaders. Kind of recap what you learned. What is a human-centered vision?
A human-centered vision is not focused on the outcome or the product or even the market so much as it is how what we're designing or what we're proposing affects the people that will actually use the thing, or the people that are involved in producing it.
Yes, it is about the people for sure. Anything you'd like to add, Paul?
No, I think, funnily enough, that pretty much covers it from my perspective. I think that ironically it links into a bullet point that you have here as well, which is around the how might we thing. And so very specifically, what I've found is that once you start to use that how might we statement, it almost inevitably pushes you more towards a vision that is human-centric.
Yeah.
And so if you can't frame it in that way, it might not be as human-centric as you think it is.
Yeah, that's your first clue, right? Here's your sign. Just to recap for those that might be listening afterwards, human-centered speaks of the whole human. It embodies the physical, what they're going to hear, see, do, touch, the mental aspects, words and images that will come to mind when they experience your company or are in a conversation about your company, as well as the human spirit and those being states that they incur as they interact with the people in your organization. How do they perceive themselves as becoming? Who are they becoming when they interact with you? Why is having a human-centered vision important?
I'll jump in on that. So
okay.
I've actually been giving this quite a lot of thought, really.
Good.
And there are some sort of fundamental reasons that are often, I think, not stated, which is that humans are customers, humans are employees, humans are friends and family members. And as we become increasingly surrounded by data and technology and robotics and AI and things like that, it's important to remember that, like, in a very real sense, sort of the reason for our existence is ourselves as humans and the human beings around us. And so having a human-centered vision acknowledges that, and acknowledges the sort of central role that humans play in almost all of our lives.
Yeah, I love it. As important as AI and technology are, they really are of zero importance if we don't have humans to utilize and take advantage of them and help them, support them with it. Scott, what about you? What are your thoughts about why it's important to have a human-centered vision?
Because I think when we focus on the individuals, we're dignifying what they care about, and we're engaging with that part of them that will engage in our objective. So even if they didn't own it initially, or they didn't originate it, it becomes a call to action for them to engage with it. And that's some of the work I do with companies that have employees that have become disengaged for whatever reason. Maybe it was mergers and acquisitions, and they feel like it's a bigger company, the hometown feel is gone, or the pandemic sent them all home to work, or they moved away and they're still working on teams that they don't live near anymore. And I think focusing on what each individual needs and how it affects them, especially in the workplace, gets their buy-in to pull together. So everybody's pulling toward the common interest.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the fascinating things to me about week one, and I actually shared it on a call today, was, I had this vision of how the discussion was going to go about all the vision statements of the four companies we talked about. And for a moment there, when it was going in all different directions and no one seemed to have the same opinion of whether that vision statement was working or not working, I was panicking. But when we brought it back to the human aspect and whether or not people could align with it as leaders and employees and what the human aspect meant, it was funny how all the conversations came together. Even though all the perspectives were wide and diverse, when we began to focus on the human part of it, they really did synergize and synthesize, I thought. And I was really kind of in awe of that, especially after my moment of panic during that conversation. So, but I think you guys have touched on it is easier for leaders and employees to align with visions. It's also a lot easier to execute delivery. It's also a lot easier for customers to say, you send them that thing, please leave me a Google review, or what do you think of our service? It's really easy for them to tell if we passed or if we failed when we have that human-centered vision. So, anyone want to share their updated or revised human-centered vision statement?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay.
The how might we?
Yeah, well, either one, the vision statement or how you flipped it to a how might we.
I'll do both. So the vision was to demonstrate the lasting good that results from organizing and designing systems around the individual nature of each human. Shining this light becomes a multi-generational legacy, reversing transgenerational trauma in society's approach to work. And how I flipped that was, how might we demonstrate the lasting good that results from organizing and designing systems around the individual nature of each human? And how might we shine a light on the multi-generational legacy to reverse the transgenerational trauma in society's approach to work?
Wow. All right. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in those conversations, but I think those are excellent examples of both the vision statement and how you flipped it to the how might we. Paul, what about you?
Yeah, it's funny. I was struggling to find it in my notes again now, which obviously means it's not locked into my brain yet, which is a good good indication that it still needs some work. Yeah. But I will tell you what kind of is locked in my brain, and it's a lot shorter, but I think there's some work to do on it. So it's how might we help organizations identify and grow adaptable and resilient workforces. And I will and there's a couple of things in there that are deliberately, if you like, not in there that I want to highlight. So
yeah,
what we've realized through our work as we're looking at this idea of adaptability and resilience from the perspective of the employee and the employer is that there is some common ground associated with a desire to build those capabilities, although sometimes for the individual employee, they need the dots kind of drawn for them as to how that equates to an improved life. But the reason that I left it at the workforce level for the employer is that there's sort of three dimensions that sit underneath that idea. So the first dimension, as it were, is that the workforce itself is an ever-changing thing. In other words, people come into that workforce in an employer. People will join you as an employer. People will leave you as an employer. And so the organic thing that is your workforce is changing. That's the first sort of angle to think about it. The second is that there is this concept of adaptability and resilience at an individual level. But then thirdly, there's the concept of adaptability and resilience at a team or group level. And those things can be in sync with each other, but often in our experience, they're not in sync with each other. And so that's why we kind of leave it there at the workforce level versus talking about, for example, adaptable and resilient employees, because that would indicate something at the individual level. And so we kind of almost like as it stands right now, we kind of almost have to stop there at the workforce level, but know that there are these underlying things that we're trying to accomplish when we're working with employers on it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And as I hear you talking about it, the word that came to me was flow. When people are adaptable and resilient, they're flowing with their work rather than fighting against it. And I think that happens individually as well as at a corporate level. So there's so many factors there. So amazing. And you nailed your how might we statement, and I think it's one that's going to serve you well. I did have some feedback, and I wanted to answer that because I think it'll be helpful as we move on. I think I don't know if we lost Candace, but I know she dropped the link to the feedback. Scott, if you want to grab it, I'd love to get your feedback on week one.
I turned in the feedback on week one, didn't I?
No, I only got a few, and well, unless you didn't sign your name to it, but the two, there was some questions on the what's missing and what could have been better, and I wanted to address those. The first one was connecting to a 3-month horizon was a little difficult. So I think a clear definition for what you were looking for in the homework would be good. Distinction between vision, the external goal, and okay. So I think a clearer definition would be good. So I think this is funny because we were talking about clarity of vision, and here I go and screw it up. But I think it proves the point of how when we don't have a clear vision, then our goals are hard to achieve, if not what's the word? You don't even understand what they are, right? So to clarify, the vision statement, which I think you guys have all nailed, is the human-centered vision. What I want you to pick out for the next 3 months is a goal that you feel most will encapsulate and get you closer to that vision. So whether that is, X number of new clients or X retention or whatever the KPI is that represents to you the number that you watch that tells you whether or not you're doing a good job at achieving that vision. Does that make sense? Okay. And the last thing, a little bit more guidance on ensuring the vision is resonating. Well, that's actually right where we're headed, because this whole process of design thinking, empathy, divining the problem, this is your guidance on how you are ensuring that it resonates. Because now that you have a clear vision, you have your how might we statement, every interaction you have the opportunity to ask your customers, your partners, your part-time employees, whatever the case may be, how might we, create this? What's working, what's not working, which are some of my favorite questions, and then digging into the 5 whys. So really, once the vision is set, to understand how you're getting closer or moving towards it is the design thinking process. Now, in a traditional, say, innovation team in an organization, you're designing one time and you're pretty much gone. When you're using it as a leadership skill, you're designing all the time. So say for this quarter, you may determine that, you have 3 problems that are the biggest challenge between you and your vision. And so you take this quarter to work on maybe 1 or 2 of them, or maybe they're such that you can work on all 3. Remember, the obstacle is the way, as the philosophers say. But so next quarter doesn't mean that you've arrived at your vision. You may have accomplished moving beyond those 3 obstacles, or you may have to reiterate and try something else. But you're going to be going through this design thinking process again and again. It's something unlike designing for a product or a service. It's ongoing, and it's ongoing with your design team, which is now those people that you work with, your employees, your customers, your partners, etc. So any other questions before we get into this week's topic? Were those questions and answers helpful for you guys?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. All right. So what is empathy? With two design thinking guys on the line, I don't even need to talk. So just tell me, go ahead and tell me what this is about, and I'll share you some definitions too.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talk about empathy over the years as like putting yourself in the other person's shoes and um, confusing it with compassion and other emotional characteristics. And I don't quite follow that. My personal belief on empathy is the ability to imagine a circumstance that is adjacent to what this person might be going through. It's highly imaginative. Like we create scenarios where we could imagine what factors are playing on their decisions or on their limits, and then we find ways to validate and address those limits.
Okay. And Paul, how do you define empathy?
I think my definition is closer to that idea of being of sort of like gaining an understanding of the other party's perspective, which could be, I mean, like sort of walking a mile in their shoes is kind of one technique to get there, but it's not necessarily the only way to get there. But it is ostensibly finding a way of connecting to the whole human that is let's say they were receiving a product, as an example. Let's say they were receiving a product, having an understanding of and a neutral understanding of how that whole human would react to and receive it, and then understanding based on what we receive, which is signals from them, what the underlying reasons could be for it. And so I think a lot of it is it tends to get conflated with things that are like directly experiencing the emotion versus observing the emotion, almost like the empaths in, if anybody's a Trekkie, right? But they or Trekker, there were empaths in that, and those people were like feeling directly the emotion that the other party was feeling. I think it's more about observing and understanding how the whole human is responding to it, and then alongside it come other skills, for example, compassion.
Yeah, I think compassion is at least my experience, because when I started this process decades ago, I would say I was exercising empathy, as we'll discuss it today, but I did not consider myself very empathic, and probably my employees at the time wouldn't say I was very empathetic either. But it was through the practice of those skills that I became more compassionate and more caring, I think, over time. So yeah, just real quick, some definitions from some of the more leading design thinking companies and organizations. Interaction Design Foundation says empathy is our ability to see the world through other people's eyes, to see what they see, feel what they feel, and experience as they do. Stanford D School, it is your effort to understand how the user does things and why, their physical and emotional needs, how they think about the world and what is meaningful to them. And IDEO says empathy is a deep understanding of the problems and realities of the people you're designing for. In other words, empathy requires you to learn about the difficulties people face and uncover their latent needs. So I think based on what you guys have discussed and my own understanding, there are bits and pieces of that I agree with, and bits and pieces of that I don't necessarily agree with, but we'll go ahead and start talking about it. To me, empathy is about transformation. Empathy isn't about understanding emotions, first and foremost, in my opinion, because when you think about people's emotions and thoughts, they come from traumas, they come from social conditioning, they come from their view of the world, they come from, what they ate for breakfast or how well they slept that night. Their emotions come from a million different places. And for us to think that we are smart enough to begin to understand someone's emotions, I think is pretty, arrogant of ourselves. But I do think that it's not about understanding emotions, but it's about helping an individual transform their emotions. there's a phrase that says emotions are simply energy in motion. And for me, empathy is about allowing individuals to release the energy of the negative emotions and help focusing, especially as a leadership skill, focusing on the energy of positive emotions that's going to create innovation that moves the world. So it's all about where's the energy and how do we help them transform it.
Yeah,
And
you know,
it's not
that really lines up well with a lot of what I've learned with DBT therapy, is that a lot of the same concepts overlap on what we do as design thinkers, because it's not about distracting from or invalidating, but understanding enough to the point to redirect toward a different course, either a change in language or a reframing of it.
yeah, yeah. And definitely have some experience in that sort of thing. So what
Well,
is
if
our
we're gonna, let me jump in on one piece of that actually. Now that I
yeah,
think about it, so to your point about design thinking and where it's, and how we're applying these skills, I suppose like empathy it's a really interesting principle that is very important. For example, when you're designing a product or you're building something, and when the way that we look at it from that perspective is that if we can develop um, a neutral understanding of the various reasons why people might or might not like what we do, and have an understanding that those people might or might not like what we do based on so many different dimensions of what it is that we offer. And
yeah,
those, and it could be tapping into any aspect of or any aspect of how they process things. So for
yeah,
example, if you think about the De Bono 6 hats stuff, right? So there might be a situation where users may or may not emotionally connect with our product,
right,
or they may or may not they may have an intellectual disagreement with what it is that we're doing, as an example, right?
yeah,
And so for us to be able to kind of like understand why users are engaging or not engaging can be very useful if there are patterns that are associated with it.
yeah,
If there are no patterns associated with it, and for example, you're producing a product and it turns out that 5% of people don't like what you do,
yeah,
then that's okay, right? Because
right,
you're not designing for everybody. But
right,
then when it transfers into a leadership sphere, that's somewhat different, because
yes,
instead of designing a product and building a product for, that you want a lot of people to like, but if 10% or 20% or even 90% of people don't like it, it doesn't matter as long as you've got enough people that do. When you transfer into a leadership scenario, what you're really dealing with is you're leading teams, but you're leading groups of individuals.
yeah,
And so having empathy for the individuals that you're engaging with, that's a different skill. And it's almost like a one-to-one skill. And you still need to be able to do that in the context of being able to understand who they are, gain a deeper understanding of who they are as a human being, so that you can relate to them as a human being. But that doesn't
yeah,
imply that you necessarily think the same way as they do, or endorse how they do, or feel every feeling they have, or any
right,
or any of those
yeah,
things. It's
yeah,
more of
exactly.
the ability to be able to understand who they are, so that you can relate and find some common ground.
Yes, and it's even more than that, and we're going to get into
Mm-hmm.
that. But I think you bring up a good point. One of the things as I was looking at Meta last week, and one of the things I read online about them was 50% of their customers don't like them, don't think
Mm-hmm.
they're doing a good job. Now, can you imagine if you had a team, even if you had a small team of 5 people, and 50% did not like you,
Yeah.
did not agree with the way you did things, did not, want to be a part of it, but had no other option. That's going to bring down your performance. That's going to bring down collaboration. There's so many problems that begin to stack up when that happens in a team
Wow.
environment. So design thinking becomes a powerful, and especially this phase, empathy that we're talking about, becomes powerful. So I don't want to get us too far down a rabbit hole here, but anyway, we'll move on, and we'll give some time for questions at the end too. this is from an article on Forbes, which Candace will drop in the comment box if you want to read it, but why empathy matters for leaders. Mutual empathy between company leaders and employees increases efficiency 88%. I mean, these stats are astounding. Efficiency 88%, creativity 87%, job satisfaction 87%, idea sharing 86%, innovation 85%, and even company revenue 83%. And that's been my experience, that going through this process with employees has a tremendous effect on that. And why it matters for leaders especially is because we are the ones that set the example. So if we are empathizing well with our employees, then guess what? When we screw up, they're going to have a little more empathy for us because we've been empathetic with them and sought to understand them as a person, not just as the position that they do for us. But some astounding stats on how impactful empathy is. All right, so let's get into the why of empathy. And I think this is interesting, and I didn't plan this way, but it does. And maybe that's because this is the way my brain works. But very much like vision, having a human-centered vision breaks down into the physical, the mental, and the spirit, so does why empathy matters. And the reason why it matters on those three levels is the physical, obviously, is the first, and that's to innovate. When the use of empathy allows us to learn about the users, how they interact with the physical, whether that's a product, the service, the company culture, the organizational structure. When we empathize with our employees, we can begin to understand the physical aspects of what they do and what the challenges are. That's how we innovate internally and externally, because a lot of times our employees are the direct connection to our customers. So not only can we learn what we can innovate on the inside, but we can also learn what we can innovate on the outside. You know, I talked about this in some writing this week online. You know, so often innovation is an island in an organization. There's this special team that gets to go and innovate, but when it becomes open source and when design thinking infiltrates the entire organization, it's almost like open source in that you get engagement, you get enthusiasm, you get people fighting for the product and service that you're making, keeping their eye out for what's going to work best. And they go from interviewing maybe 8 to 10 to 50 customers to having thousands of inputs from, you know, however many employees the customers the employees interacts with in a week. So that's the physical aspect of it. The mental aspect of why empathy matters is it allows us to influence our employees. And I'm talking in a positive way here. The use of empathy allows us to understand an individual's perspective, their lived experience, their values, beliefs, and more. You know, one thing I learned in a NLP course that I took was that in any moment we could receive, I think it was like 11 million, maybe I got the number wrong, bits of information. Our mind is calculating all that. But once it filters through our processes, our decisions, our experiences, our traumas, all that stuff, it brings it down to about 50 bits of information. And that's a huge discrepancy, 11 million, billion, whatever, to 50. And I think a good example of that is if you watch any crime TV and people are reporting about what they saw or what they understood of a crime, and it's always different. Everyone had a different perspective, a different point of view, a different what they saw. And so when you're empathizing with your employees on the mental level, you begin to understand, not to make them wrong, but to see where they can add value from these aspects of themselves, but also to see where maybe you can add value to them by giving them a different perspective or clarifying some communication that maybe they only got, one version of it when there was something else. So it really opens up a dialogue when you empathize, so that you can learn these things about them and what's going on inside their head. And I think lastly, and I'm going to move over you guys' picture here so I can read this. The empathy, why it matters, is it impacts spiritually. The use of empathy allows us to understand an individual's being state, how they're showing up, how they would like to show up, and helping them bridge the gap. So, oftentimes we may have a specific thought or feeling about a situation and how it went down. That is all part of our programming and our experience of the day. But that may not always be the most positive view of a situation. And when you think about who it is we want to be and who it is we want to become, and I think as leaders, that's part of our role in employees and our conversations with them, how do we get them to the place that they want to go, the place where they want to be and where they want to become? Universally, every individual wants to be loved, accepted, wants to feel they're capable, and wants to feel they're worthy. And so oftentimes situations can draw us away from that truth. And as leaders, when we have the opportunity to bring them back to that truth, we can really have a tremendous impact on them. Thoughts and comments about the why: to innovate, to influence, to impact.
I have a question.
Yes.
I've been pondering the connection between this and diversity inside organizations, and specifically neurodiversity. So, in a lot of the work that we do, we work with full organizations. And so we're working, when you're working inside large organizations, you're generally in organizations, even of 100, 150, there's enough diversity inside those organizations whereby you'll often have, several people inside that organization that have an officially diagnosed neurodivergent condition.
Yeah.
And obviously, in many cases, those that neurodiversity impacts their ability to show up in a way, for work in a way that connects with the way in which you tend to think if you don't share that neurodivergent condition.
Yeah.
And so, and particularly this can be a challenge if there's no diagnosis, right? If there's not been an official diagnosis, so you're not officially aware of this. So anyway, so that gets me in a very long-winded way to my question, which is, how do you think we should focus on creating and using empathy in scenarios where, for want of a better term, our brains are fundamentally wired in a very, very different way to the people that we're working with?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that you brought up DEI, and I actually had done a webinar with a group out of India. For me, design thinking unlocks the gold of DEI without a single dollar spent on developing programs for it. Because when you're doing this process with your team, with your employees, one, you're listening to all the diverse opinions and perspectives. Two, you're respecting their values and gifts, which we may not get into in the empathy phase. We'll definitely get into in the ideate phase. And three, you're including everyone. You're including everyone. So I think this process is a gold mine for implementing those policies in an organization. I think it happens as a natural outcome of how this process works with teams. But give me your question one more time, because I'm not
That's okay.
sure. I was getting excited there. I might not have gotten to the point.
It's totally okay, because I was on a long journey before I got to my question. So I think my point was that that if you're in a team or in a larger organization, and if you have good diversity within that organization, then it's entirely possible and indeed likely that you're going to have people that you are leading whose brains are wired in a very different way to yours. So even the way in which they communicate these things may be difficult for you to resonate with. Like take neurodiversity out of it, as in like neurodivergent conditions. Take that out of it. Take the scenario, for example, where, if you think about the insights stuff, right? And we've got a boss who's very red, right? Wants very direct, likes and thrives on very direct communication. Mm-hmm. And then you've got people, and you're that boss, and then you work under you, and then you've got somebody like me who rambles a lot, right? And how do those and how, as a boss, do you overcome the fact that your style of thinking is so different to the style of thinking that you're the employee that you're looking to impact or looking to engage with? Just the way in which you talk about things, the way in which you think about things is so radically different that it gets lost in translation before you even get to this, to the things that you actually do connect on. You're almost unable to experience empathy because you just think in such a radically different way to them. I've had bosses who, I want to talk to them for 5 minutes about something, and 10 seconds in they've checked out. Right. And that's about their style of thinking as it is as much as anything else. So my curiosity really is around what kind of practical techniques we use to ensure that we can use, can exert these skills when our communication styles are often so different. And of course, the corollary to that is neurodivergent conditions that can make it even more challenging.
I'm going to ask you to bookmark the question, because I think we're going to address some of it in the how. We're going to go through the how, why, and when and where and all that. But I do believe that ego is the number one roadblock to empathy. And Candace is going to drop that link. I have a YouTube video on that and how to get around that, but we'll talk more about it. But yes, you have to be willing to go into these sessions with your employees or your customers or your partners, whoever they are, with a beginner's mindset that you don't know everything. Your viewpoint may not be right or may not be at 100%, and there's something for you to learn. So we'll talk about that. But this kind of diagram for me kind of sums it up. When we're able to articulate the company's vision, and when we are able to understand the employees' needs, it is the intersection of those two where we can have everything that we want. The employees can be successful, the companies can be successful. I love Zig Ziglar's quote, you can have everything in life you want if you help enough other people get what they want. And I just want to share a story. Has anyone heard the parable of the long spoons?
No.
Okay, wonderful. Candace is going to drop an article if you want to read the full article, but I want to share with you the parable of the long spoons, because to me, it puts meat on the bones of this graphic. And one day a man said to God, I'd like to know what are heaven and hell like. God showed the man two doors, and inside the first one, in the middle of the room, was a large round table with a large pot of vegetable stew. It smelled delicious, and it made the man's mouth water. But the people sitting around the table were thin and sickly. They appeared to be famished. They were holding spoons with very long handles, and each found it impossible to reach into the pot of stew and take a spoonful. But because the handle was longer than the spoons, they could not get the spoons back to their mouths. The man shuddered at the sight of their misery and suffering, and God said, "You have seen hell." Behind the second door, the room appeared exactly the same. Again, the large round table with a large pot of stew made the man's mouth water. The people had the same long-handled spoons, but they were well nourished and plump, laughing and talking. The man said, I don't understand. God said, it is simple, he said. Love only requires one skill. These people have learned early on to share and feed one another, while the greedy only think for themselves. And I just think that is a great parable of how, if we are clear about what our needs are, which is the company vision, and we take the time as leaders to understand and be clear about what the employees' needs are, then we can begin to work together, even though our arms may be shorter than our spoons, to help one another in achieving what those needs are that need to be met. And to me, that's the power of design thinking as a leadership practice. Let's dig into how to empathize. And just a few key points here. Obviously, some of these will be redundant since you are obviously experts and practitioners of design thinking, but one is to set the expectations. And when I started using design thinking as a leadership practice, I always had a disclosure, especially when I was meeting with a new team. Like if I had just gotten into leading a new team and I wanted to have all these conversations with the employees, I would always have a disclaimer, and it went something like this. Today, I want to discuss the vision for the team. I value your insights and your experience. Yours, combined with everyone else on the team, will ensure we are successful in our vision. In light of this vision, I want to hear what's working, what's not, what can be improved. And this is kind of the disclosure that's important with employees. While there are certain constraints like budgets, technology, and limited resources, I want you to be open in your feedback while balancing it with the understanding that our limitations do exist, and ask, will you do that for me? And most certainly they will. So we also have to understand, which you guys probably already know, 20% is about asking, or 20% is asking questions, 80% is listening, observing, seeking to understand. So it's not just starting with those three questions: what's working, what's not, how can we improve? It's also about digging deep into those 5 whys. Also, always want to express gratitude for their time, for their willingness to be open. Be curious. Set expectations for yourself before you go into these meetings, because when you set them for yourself, that sets your subconscious mind of where you want it to go, and that will keep that ego mind from not getting in the way as easily. What do you expect to learn? You want to learn something new. You want to learn something that makes you a better leader. You want to learn something that makes the team better, something that will make communication and collaboration easier, all the things that are important. Shutting off the chattering of the ego mind. This is the absolute biggest obstacle to listening to other people whose opinions or methods for communicating may not be like yours. Mm-hmm. And Candace is going to share that video link, but a couple of things that you can do that will help you shut off the ego mind is to take handwritten notes, to keep yourself present, take down ideas, key ideas, maybe jot down other questions you want to ask. Keep yourself engaged in the conversation. Let's go back. Any other thoughts or comments on how you can do that?
Well, I really like the handwritten notes clue for the specific reason of fighting the chattering mind, because I tend to not take notes unless I'm typing into my phone or my laptop.
Yeah.
Or Otter AI is taking an entire transcript. But in the past, I have found handwriting notes as a distraction. But in this case, I think using it intentionally and just holding yourself to a couple of words or phrases to get an idea, especially at key points when you feel your mind start to get triggered a little bit.
Yeah.
That can be very effective. Also, something I was thinking about with, as far as expectations for the group, for myself, and to demonstrate curiosity, a question I like to ask is, what am I not seeing? Like, tell me what I don't get from the view I'm at. Like, what do you see that I don't see that somebody needs to know?
Yeah.
That usually opens up a space where people can a lot of times these people, something's been bugging them for a while and they just assume no one's going to listen.
Yeah.
You open up that space, that's when you might hear it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the note taking is really critical, not only for you and quieting that ego mind, keeping you present, keeping you engaged in the conversation. It also sends a powerful message to the employee or the teammate you're talking to. Like, they value what I'm saying so much, they're going to take notes about it.
Yeah.
You know, and once you begin taking notes in this manner, you'll ask clarifying questions. You'll start to star when do they light up in the conversation, because that's clues to how you can touch their spirit, how you can bring out that best of who they want to become when you see them light up. There's so much that you can note take on besides just, you know, he said this, she said that, this is what happened, this is how they do that. So it's a really good tool on a number of different levels.
Yeah, and I wonder why I don't, because whenever I'm involved in something physical or structural or a space, I always take notes.
Yeah.
When it's organizational or person to person, I don't. So I have to examine that a little bit. Like, why? What was my motive or lack of motive in there? That's going to take a little investigation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, introspection's always a good thing, I find. All right. I don't want to run us over too much, but who to empathize with. You know, look at your team. Who is it that you interact with on a daily or monthly basis that has a role to play in the vision that you're trying to achieve? This could be your, you know, if you're inside an organization, this could be your superior, your boss, which I think it sends a wonderful message that you're going to them and saying, I want to clarify, this is the vision I need to be focused on. What do you see as, you know, what's working, what's not, what could be improved? Obviously, the employees, contract hires, short-term freelancers, and business partners. You know, most organizations are large enough, even if they're 10 people, that there are other departments or other, you know, vendors or suppliers that impact how well they do their jobs on a daily basis. Those are people that you want to empathize with. Anyone else you can think of? When and where? I like setting at least an hour, 30 minutes to an hour. And we're talking, you can, you know, once you get in the groove of using this on a quarterly basis or even a semi-annual basis, you'll know how much time this takes, and it'll take less time. You know, like the first time I walked into a team leading them as a new manager, they didn't know me, I didn't know them. I would spend an hour with them, but you know, once you're well established in a team, this could be as little as 15 minutes, especially if you've been through it more times than not. Place, you want to be in an enclosed room, even if it's virtual, somewhere you can have a private conversation, free from distractions, silence your technology, step away from your screens, step away from windows. If you're one of those persons, oh no, a squirrel, you know, if you're one of those easily, which I think most of us are that way these days, easily distracted, try and do the best you can to kind of isolate yourself so you're not distracted, so they know that they have your individual attention, because there's nothing more, I don't know, disengaging than to have someone tell you they're here and they want to understand you better, and then all of a sudden, you know, their phone going off is more important, or an email popping in from the boss is more important, or whatever the case may be. So really pick the when and where, and think about the human that you're talking to and what's going to be important for them. All right, strategies and their importance. Let's unpack what we learned today. What were some strategies that you thought were interesting, best practices, and important, and why?
Well, this actually might be related to the thing that you just went through, which is the when and the where. If I can sort of pose a slightly contrarian view on that.
Sure.
I think I completely agree that the when and the where is extremely important. I think that the when and the where probably is something that you might tailor to the individual interaction. So as an example, one of the best managers I ever had, whenever we had a conversation along the lines of the one that you're talking about, he and I agreed that the best way for us to do that was on a walk. And so we would actually, and that obviously obviated his ability to write stuff down, but he was good at, he was good, he was good afterwards. But we shifted from a very sterile, very, I would say sort of like almost prison cell-like environment to an environment where we were basically kind of like walking among nature as we were having these discussions, and order of magnitude more impactful engagement happened as a result. So I think the important thing here is to make sure that you're considering the when and the where and the right when and the where for the specific type of interaction.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And actually, Steve Jobs loved that method as well. Mm-hmm. And to think about it, you know, if you and I went out on a walk after we've been in the office all week or whatever, that change of scenery is automatically going to put us into a different state of mind, a more open state of mind. You're open out in the nature, out in public. So, yeah, I think it's certainly something to listen to your intuition, but do what is going to create the environment for them to be comfortable and open and share. And that would be a great opportunity for you to use your otter while you're walking if you didn't want to miss out on what they were saying.
Absolutely.
Scott?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Paul. I'm a big fan of walking. I think the empathy begins before the request for meeting. We need to know enough about the person to know what's going to work best for them. There's a lot of cases where I've really been able to uncover some ground by having 2 or 3 people together. And it's not enough to devolve into groupthink, but it's more than just one person feeling like they're on the spot. That's kind of a magic number for me.
Yeah, I think that's a good addition. Any other strategies that you liked or would like to add?
Well, one thing I would add is that technology can be our friend on this stuff. So the skill, if you think of empathy as a skill, the skill of empathy is something that in our work we've observed is starting to degrade in some settings. And there are multiple reasons for that. Some of those are societal, some of those are us descending into our tribes online and things like that, and hearing just voices that we agree with and all that kind of stuff. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that sociologists and psychologists have been looking at. But one of the factors appears to be that as people are moving into remote and hybrid organizations and they are becoming more disconnected from each other physically, they're doing more work on their own, and they're spending a lot less time having even online, having discussions, open discussions like the ones we're having right now. If you do less of this, you get worse at it. And so it becomes something that we need to, that we consciously need to practice. We've talked about, we've given Otter like 3 free commercials on this so far, but Otter or whatever is a great tool for that. So a good example for me would be like, I have to work on the idea of listening more and talking less because I do a lot of teaching. So that leads me to talk a lot more in many cases.
Sure.
So I have to work on listening more and talking less. So with permission, I'm often using Otter. But when I use Otter, one of the first things I look at is how much was I talking and how much was the other party talking. And I'm using that as a measure to help me cut through my natural tendency to talk too much.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's a blog post in there.
Probably.
How to measure our own growth on empathy.
Yeah, Paul, I did exactly that. I got off a meeting today, and the first thing I did was scan my Otter notes to see whose blocks of paragraphs were bigger, mine or theirs.
Yeah.
And the frequency. Yeah.
Well, funnily enough, the podcast really helps with that too. So I look at the previous podcasts I've done, and I used to be like talking as much as my guest in many cases, and that's got less and less and less over time as I've consciously worked on it.
Yeah, great additions. Anything else before we wrap up? We're already over, but I don't want to rob the audience that's going to watch this later of any nuggets of wisdom that you guys want to share.
No, I really liked how you broke out the physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of empathy, especially as it relates to our vision, because if our vision is to connect with people, then we have to break it out that way.
Yeah, and I really felt understanding that empathy can innovate, it can influence, and it can impact. And as leaders, we want to be doing all three of those. Then it's very important that we look at all three and we try to understand all three. I'm glad you like that, Scott. Thank you for that feedback. Thank you guys for joining week 2 of Design Thinking for Leaders. 2 weeks. We'll be back again talking about defining the problem. Ready to advance your design thinking skills? Engage with me on LinkedIn, where I talk about leading by design, everything at the crossroads of innovation, design thinking, and leadership. You can also enroll in accelerate your implementation of leading by design by enrolling in coaching and bringing design thinking into your organization via speaking engagements, custom workshops, and consulting. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about defining the problem using design thinking as a leadership practice.